am a detective for 10 years. I am assigned to help the FBI with the most brutal cases they have to offer. It affects my everyday life and relationships. I might have to cancel a date with my wife, or I can't make my son's football game. And to give you an idea of the situation, I just missed my daughter's graduation last week. I am chasing probably one of the worst type of serial killers America has ever seen. His name is Brian Wilson, but goes by the name of the Phantom Killer. He has the name because no one knows what he actually looks like these days. You might wonder what I meant by that, but Brian has an incredible way of disguising his appearance using latex and special effects makeup. He would have no problem throwing together a female face if he liked. So that is the worst thing about him, other than the brutal way he murders his victims. The FBI, police, and myself have no idea what he looks like. I had to make my wife and kids' safety my number one priority. I never take any precautions with Brian, so had a cop car to pick them up and bring them to a safe house because something very big is about to go down. You will learn what it is in a few moments. I waited until the cop car pulled up and an African American cop pulled down his window and said, "Hey there, sir, I'll have your wife and kids put in the address you were given and give you a call when we are there." I thanked the officer and walked back into my house to get ready for a busy night. I think I might have hit a break though, as Brian, one of the most notorious killers America has ever seen, had emailed a guy who does a hugely successful podcast and offered him an interview. The rules were his though, which were 1. No cops or anyone gets told until the interview is over. 2. It won't be over Skype or the phone, etc. It would have to be face to face. 3. It would have to be in a place chosen by Brian. The podcast guy goes by the name of Fred Jackson. His podcast is a true crime podcast called Fred's True Crime Podcast. He averages about 1 million listeners a week. He is hot property, which is mostly the reason Brian chose him to be interviewed. I wondered though, what was behind this podcast? What had Brian in mind? I guessed no doubt he had evil intentions. Or else maybe he was just feeding his ego, which was evil of course, because his ego was built on leaving trails of blood behind. Fred of course told me about this podcast interview, and we discussed it with the police and several FBI agents. This guy wasn't just any ordinary fugitive. He is probably one, if not the most dangerous fugitives in the United States of America. We gave Fred a tracking device, and over many different ideas thrown around, we came to the conclusion the best place he could have his tracking device was inside the sole of his shoe. Me and several others will have a live GPS tracking device, knowing where he is exactly. We knew that we could not be seen, or it would be all over for Fred. When we were tailing him, we were using a public bus we got a loan of with actors and actresses in it. We also didn't want them in danger, so still made the driver know he had to stay at least 10 places behind Fred, as Brian more than likely would be with him in the car when we made the move. Fred got a time and place, 10 p.m. behind an old warehouse just out of town. We obviously knew the bus couldn't drive in there, so we had people on foot, hiding, ready for them since 7 p.m, carefully making sure their presence wasn't known. I was hidden behind a tree, looking directly at the back of the warehouse, when, as expected, on the dot of 10, I saw Fred's car arrive. He got out and checked his watch, making sure he was on time. I waited in anticipation. There was a shout from behind a barrel at the side of the warehouse. "Hey there, Fred! Thanks for this big break, giving me some time on your famous murder radio show." What happened next, I couldn't believe my eyes. Fear gathered up in my chest, and my heart beat so fast I could hear it thumping in my ears. When the figure of Brian came into view, I could see that he was the same African American man that took my wife and kids to the safe house. I felt fear take over me with the realization that Brian's latest disguise and prosthetic face was of an African American man that claimed to be a cop to me just today. Brian knew that my wife and kids were meant to be taken to a safe house. But wherever they are now, Brian, the Phantom Killer, has them. And that's if they're still even alive. I was frozen in fear for a few seconds, knowing that the Phantom Killer had my wife and kids somewhere. But I knew that I couldn't mess this up now. I had to think fast what to do. I made the fast decision to lie low, knowing Brian's intelligence. He probably knows I'm watching. Fred approached Brian slowly and carefully and asked, "So, is this what you really look like, or is it just another one of your disguises?" Brian replied, "Nah, I just wanted to know what it's like to be a cop, so I decided to be a cop. It was very convenient when I took Mr. Sam Waters' wife and kids to a safe house." Fred held up his hands. "I'm not armed, and I'm not wired, so why don't we just get this podcast over with?" Brian looked suspiciously at Fred. Now, Freddy boy, what's the big rush? Don't you remember I said they were my rules? Fred was about to reply when Brian pulled out a gun and faced it right at him. Fred screamed, but didn't want to let Brian know there were cops watching, or he would definitely pull the trigger. Brian pulled the gun back and started laughing at Fred. Brian said in a mocking way, "Geez, Freddy boy, you sure are uptight. How am I meant to get you to interview me if I blow your head off?" I was watching this all unfold, knowing that I had to do something. I knew that Brian was one of the most intelligent killers in America, and he would have definitely thought it through, me running out to him right now, so I stayed behind the tree. Brian said, "Let's go into the warehouse, shall we?" Fred said, "Sure, but I need to get my mic and stuff out of the car." Brian gave him a suspicious look again and said, "Well, it looks like I better help you then." Fred got his recording equipment out of his car and they both walked into the warehouse. Sam knew he had to make a move now and also knew he had to get Brian alive or he might never find out where his kids and wife are. He slowly went into the warehouse. Within a few seconds, there was a huge explosion. The whole building was rigged with C4 explosives, and it went up in a matter of seconds. The fire was dancing high in the air as the whole building was burning intensely. The cops all came out of their hiding places and knew that Sam, Brian and Fred were undoubtedly burned alive. The local sheriff said, "Son of a bitch, he wanted to kill himself and kill his biggest hunter." The cops had to stand back from the building and wait for the firefighters to arrive, knowing no one could have survived that explosion, let alone being in that fire. The smoke alone would kill anyone. Later that night, the local sheriff held a press conference. "Dear men and women and children of America, it is with my sadness and regret that one of the finest detectives I've ever worked with has sadly lost his life in a deadly fire, along with podcast personality Fred Jackson and serial killer Brian Wilson, otherwise known as the Phantom Killer. It is with regret that I can also inform you, just minutes before the killer killed himself in a rigged explosion to end his life and the others, he had confessed to taking the identity of a police officer and took Sam Waters' wife and children, which meant even though we had him in clear target to shoot, we couldn't afford to kill him, or we might never find out where he has Mr. Waters' wife and kids. We will work tirelessly to find out exactly where they are and keep you updated. The Phantom Killer might now be gone, but he made sure to get revenge in the biggest way by taking with him Sam, a detective that was so close to finally capturing him. R.I.P. to Sam and Fred. As Sam Waters was following Brian Wilson and the Phantom Killer into the warehouse, the explosion was deafening, and within seconds the whole building was engulfed in flames. Brian smiled as he fell through a trapdoor, safely sliding to safety down into an underground bunker he had spent months on end building. He knew it would withstand the blast. As he fell into the bunker, he quickly rolled out of the way as Fred Jackson came rolling out next. Fred was dazed while Brian had his eyes fixed to a chute in front of him where Sam Wilson dropped out of the chute within seconds. Brian laughed and said, "Hey, rough landing, but hey, it's better than being blown to smithereens by explosives. Hey, Sammy boy?" Sam was shaking in fear, but a part of him was relieved he wasn't killed in the explosion. Brian held the gun to them and said, "Okay, here is the part where you strip your clothes and shoes off completely. I need to make sure there's no tracking devices." It just struck Brian that everything he was saying would be heard if they were wearing a listening device. He kicked himself for that flaw in his otherwise ingenious plan. Both Sam and Fred stripped completely, and Brian walked over and handcuffed them both, and tied their legs to a bar so they couldn't escape, as he checked their clothes for any devices. He smiled when he discovered there were none. After a thorough search, he threw the clothes back to them and uncuffed them and told them they could get dressed. Up on the ground outside the burning building, the sheriff said to one of his officers, "Do you know what's funny about this whole thing? The officer replied, "What, sir?" "I am looking at that tracking device. Put in the shoe, and that thing is in one place. Not moving, but just in one place. But if that was in that fire, wouldn't the signal be lost?" The sheriff looked at the officer. "Are you following me, boy?" He replied, "Yes, sir. Do you think somehow they're still alive?" The sheriff said, "Let's hope so." It was like an oven with the heat in the bunker and the burning flames above them, but yet they were free from danger. Brian smiled at both men and said, "Well, do ye not give me credit for my ingenious plan? By the way, I suppose, Sam, you're wondering where your wife and kids are. Would you believe they're just across in the other room? But not to raise your hopes, they will not be able to survive much longer, as no one is going to know they're down here. I have enjoyed our friendship, Sammy boy. I must say, I kind of enjoyed the cat and mouse chase we were playing all over the years. But I'm afraid, my friend, there comes a time all good things come to an end, and this, my friend, is the end for you." Brian looked over at Fred and said, "And you, Freddy boy, you might wonder why you got involved in all this. Well, you see, you joined yourself, really, by accepting my interview. I was going to do a live podcast and then have you killed, but I said, this will be better. Everyone is going to think that I am gone, killed, gone from this god-forsaken world. But you see, the truth is, I will be walking out that tunnel I took months building, and I will be a free man, thankfully. I won't have to keep watching over my back all the time and being like a bloody special effects makeup artist." Sam shouted, "Let my wife and kids go, you sick bastard!" Brian pointed his gun at Sam's head and said, "No, you see, that wouldn't end well for me, would it?" Sam knew his end was coming, and suddenly there was a gunshot. Sam fell to the ground. Fred screamed, looking at Sam fall hard on the ground. He then saw Brian fall to the ground. Sam's eyes opened. He realized somehow he was alive, and his vision cleared. As he looked up, he could see the sheriff above him. The sheriff said, "Are you alright, son? Are ye guys okay?" Sam smiled and said, "I had seen better days." Then he lifted his finger and pointed towards the direction Brian told them he had his wife and kids held captive. The sheriff looked over at Fred. "Well, son, you sure will have a lot to talk about on your next podcast." Fred smiled and said, "What made ye guys guess we weren't killed in that explosion?" The sheriff pointed to Fred's shoe and said, "The answer is in your shoe." Fred thought, of course, the tracking device, and thanked God Brian didn't check his shoe better. A few days later, Sam Waters, his wife and kids were guests on Fred's podcast show, and the listenership ratings went through the roof, giving Fred's True Crime podcast the highest rating ever for his show. Hi everyone, and welcome along to this special edition of my podcast where I will be interviewing my good friend Sam Waters and his wife and kids. As ye all know by now, we were all involved in a dramatic hostage situation by Brian Wilson, who ye all know as the Phantom Killer. I don't want to give him any fame by mentioning his name a lot, but Sam, could you please explain how you felt during the hostage situation? Hi Fred. First, I want to thank you for the success of your podcast, and I'd like to just thank the public for their outpour of best wishes to us all over the last few days on social media, etc. I really thought the minute I heard the blast of the bomb that we were dead, but as soon as I realised we were sliding to safety, all I could think about was rescuing my wife and kids. And to us all be here safe together is one of the best feelings ever.